Mohammed is coming. Oh, yes. Oh, good.
Speaking of big heads, is that why that came?
What? Yeah.
Speaking of big heads, is that why that came?
I'm sorry.
She said her head was in the way.
No,
And
no.
you said, oh, Muhammad's coming. So
Muhammad.
is it because he has a big head?
No. He's in big trouble. In big trouble. In my house. In everything in the world. Like, I keep reading about deadlines.
Are the handouts online for them?
He texted.
Yeah.
Handouts.
Yeah, okay, so people who are out there would have gotten the
Yeah.
virtual
There
handout.
was a link. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. So we're going to start. If you may allow me to introduce Dr. Heather Weger here at Virginia International University at the School of Education. I'll introduce you shortly if I may. Dr. Heather Weger has been in the English Language Institute, English language field since 1999, when she began her English teaching career in Germany. She holds a PhD in Applied Linguistics from Georgetown University, as well as 2 Master's of Arts degrees, one in teaching in TESOL and bilingual education from Georgetown University, one in adult and higher education from University of Oklahoma. She has been teaching full-time at Georgetown since 2007 and is currently an associate teaching professor in the English language program housed in the English Language Center. So welcome again, Dr. Weger.
Thank
you for your
you.
time.
Thank you very much. Well, I know we have a small group of folks here, and there's a virtual group out there. Hello, virtual group. I actually want to start with just a few general questions, and I'd like to know how many of you enjoy taking tests? Yeah, I'm not surprised. No one here is raising their hand. I assume those of you at home are also not raising your hand. How many of you enjoy grading tests? Oh, you don't mind. Oh, I hate it. And this is a love-hate relationship that I tend to have with assessment, which is that it is a useful and necessary component of the education process. It's useful for students. Well-designed assessment can have a backwash effect, which means that it can impact the classroom efficiently and effectively, helping us to be encouraged to design more effective classroom instruction. And these are all of the good aspects of assessment. But at the same time, for me anyway, whether I'm taking a test or grading a test, it's not a particularly enjoyable experience, and it can be very time-consuming, very labor-intensive, and that's part of the bad part of assessment. And the rubric is a type of assessment grading tool that has both good and bad components to it, and it's that tension between those two areas that I find interesting. And navigating the tension is necessary, especially now in our modern times. Assessment has always been a part of the educational landscape, but in more recent years it's become a touchstone for good practices. And there's a heightened awareness for transparency and alignment of student performance and student grades, and assessment fits within that paradigm. And so today I'm going to talk with you about one particular component of assessment, and that component would be the rubric. We'll start with a brief overview of some of the principles of assessment design, then look specifically at rubric design, and I'd like to spend a good bit of time dealing with some of the challenges that rubrics present to us. Now, the rubric, before we move any further, since that is the basic topic of our talk today, the rubric itself is not the assessment event in total. It's only one part of the assessment event. It's the way that we give a grade to a particular event. And the rubric was fundamentally created to try to address an apparent, I've forgotten the word I want, seemingly arbitrary assignment of grades for different types of products. So when I think back on my own educational experience, I was the, excuse the geeky reflection here, I was that A student from high school that went to college and got that first B on a major paper, and I was like, oh no, what have I done? How did I get a B? And when I looked at the paper prepared for some sort of feedback or comments, there were really none. Maybe a few question marks here or there in the margins, but I didn't really have a good sense or understanding about what had happened and how I had fallen short of the grade that I had hoped to receive. And when I became an educator myself, I began to notice early on in my career that a student might be giving a presentation and have absolutely nothing interesting to say, but they were very fluent. And then I had the student who struggled to present information, but the information that they were giving me was actually quite insightful or quite interesting. So I had this tension that I had to figure out how to deal with, how to differentiate those two performances, how to help the students understand what they were doing well and not well on those two different performances. And also, grading, assessment inherently needs to differentiate between high and low performing individuals, and so I needed to create assessment means to help create that differentiation for grading purposes. So those are some fundamental topics and issues and challenges myself that led me into this discussion or discovery of the rubric as one means of managing the different tensions. So as a quick beginning here to the concept of assessment, we often use assessment and test interchangeably. I myself do it as well. In some ways they're synonyms, but actually when we think about the two terms, they do have different scopes. Assessment being the larger scope. Assessment can be both informal and formal, and it's the formal understanding of assessment that we can often gloss as being a test. And a test, in contrast, as you see here on the screen, is something that's often considered to be explicit and also structured. I'd like to give you two quotes to consider for a moment. The first is, they're both by the same person, by Brown in 2004, and the first quote focuses on an understanding of assessment, sort of the philosophy behind assessment. A good teacher never ceases to assess students, whether those assessments are incidental or intended. And if you'll contrast that quote with another quote by Brown, a test measures performance, but the results imply competence. So I'd like to give those of you at home a few minutes to read and think about what those two quotes are trying to tell us about assessment versus test. And for those of you who are here, if you would think about those for a moment and also share that comment with your partner, with someone that's sitting close to you. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on ahead. What I'd like to point out or focus on is the notion under assessment that even though we're going to be talking about formal assessment today, it's very important to remember that the larger scope of assessment is that it is always happening. And it happens on a daily basis in the classroom. And that is equally important to, and perhaps we can argue that it's even more important to a student's development and growth than the more formal aspect that we're going to be focusing on today. And in terms of a test, I'd like to point out here this notion or this tension between performance and competence, because really what we're measuring, what we can capture reasonably is what a person does, what the outward behavior is. And from that, we're making assumptions about what's happening in the brain, what's happening in terms of the storage of knowledge or the understanding of the knowledge. And that can lead to mismatches between what they're able to produce, what we're able to observe, and actually how the student is thinking or processing information. This is really to give you a hint that I tend to raise, I think, more questions than I answer. I think that's part of good pedagogy, is to take a critical approach to your own practice and understanding the limitations that all of our solutions have. In terms of designing assessment, there are several guiding questions that we can ask ourselves. The first three I have here are why assess, when assess, and what to assess. So when you think about why assessing, this can be a very personal question. Are you being required to assess because of institutional mandates? Is this something that you're doing because you believe it is helpful to the goals you have for your specific classroom? The answers to these kinds of more global questions will help you understand how you are reacting to the assessment tools that you're creating. In terms of when to assess, this could be something like, are you assessing at the beginning or end of a semester? Is this something that you're assessing during the semester at multiple points? Is it a repeated event? Is it a one-time event? And the third question, what to assess, is focused on the topic or the content. Are you trying to assess content knowledge about a science principle, about a mathematic equation, about a theory of international relations? Or are you trying to assess a language skill? Are you trying to assess a writing ability or a listening ability? So you want to be clear about these three questions. Our focus today is on the fourth question, which is how to assess. Once you've decided the why, the when, and the what, we need to think of the how. And how can be approached from at least two different aspects, the tool and then the score for the tool. Right, so the tool is often approached, or the tool is the means of eliciting student performance. And tools are often thought of as traditional or alternative, where a traditional tool would be like a multiple choice test, and an alternative tool could be like a portfolio or a job interview, a mock job interview, or a poster. So these are common classifications of different types of assessment tools, where the tool is the means for eliciting student production in an event. And then we need to move on to the scoring. How do we score the tool? And that is the focus today. There's many different ways to score a tool. The most simple way on a traditional multiple choice test is as a percentage, right? How many did you get right? How many did you get wrong? Did you get a half point? And you calculate a percentage. In terms of more complex productions, there tends to be three different approaches. The Gestalt approach, which is what I experienced in my undergraduate years when I just got that B and didn't understand really what the B meant. It's just, hey, here's your B, right? Then there's the checklist model, where you might see a list of items and different points that you get for accomplishing a certain set of items. And then finally there is the rubric, which kind of blows up the checklist and gives you more details than you would find in a checklist. Now I'd like to take a brief moment to think about, especially if you haven't been exposed to many rubrics, to really think about what is a rubric, how is a rubric constructed. And my example here is best for those who are present because they get cookies. So could I ask my able assistant here to pass along my cookies? And if anyone has ever heard me speak of rubrics before, you know that cookies are always involved, especially at 3:30 in the afternoon. So while my able assistant is passing out the cookies, I want you to think about what makes a cookie good, right? What are the qualities? What are the characteristics? How do we decide that we have eaten a satisfactory cookie? How do we decide that we've eaten an excellent cookie? How do we decide that we're only going to take one bite and throw the rest of the cookie in the trash can? So those who are here, give me some ideas of what makes a cookie a bad cookie, what makes a cookie a great cookie. Any idea?
Texture.
Texture. Okay, the texture of the cookie.
Ingredients.
What are the ingredients for the cookie?
Organic.
Mm-hmm.
Gluten-free.
Yeah.
Any others? One more maybe? The textures, the ingredients,
Taste.
the taste of the cookie would be an important one. Right?
The timing.
The timing?
If I'm not hungry, so.
Ah, this is a good point, right? Oh, and we're getting at something that will come up again a little later, which is the subjectivity that is inherent in a rubric, right? But you guys have named several of my ideas. One was the number of chocolate chips. That would be like the ingredients, right? The greater the number of chocolate chips, the better the cookie, right? The color of the cookie. Right? So whether it's golden brown, whether it's a little too pale or too dark, or if it's burned, right? And then the texture of the cookie. I personally like it chewy in the middle but crispy edges. Right? As a good cookie, it might either be chewy in the middle or have crispy edges, but not both. And if it's bad, it's just hard. Right? Some of the things that are going to pop up here already is that this is a subjective decision, right? What makes a cookie good for you is not necessarily what makes a cookie good for me. And also there are certain types of categories that are going to be easier to quantify, like the number of chocolate chips. If you have, if that is a part of the rubric and you have a number attached to the description, it's easier to manage it. So when we talk about the design features, you'll see red and green here. This is a more academic example for you, an analytic rubric that takes a look at ideas and critical thinking. So in the red, you see the categories. This is what does it take to make a quality level thinking activity. So here we have critical point, development and support of ideas, use of sources, analysis, and integration. Those are the categories. And then in the green area, you see the descriptions. So we have all the way from 1, which is lack of skills, to 5, which is exemplary. You might also see this in terms of an A, B, C, D, F arrangement. Right? But the idea is that for each of the grade distinctions, you have a description that tells you what it takes to be the highest score within that category. So that leaves us to think about the good and the bad of rubrics, right? In terms of the good, we have 2 primary positives. The first is that a good rubric can help a learner distinguish stronger from weaker skills. These are the categories, the areas that are in red, right? Maybe a student has great organization, but they have really crappy grammar, right? So the student can see within the rubric the high score for the ideas, but the lower score for the grammar component. Right? Also, rubrics are perceived as more objective than a simple letter grade. I have an emphasis here on the word perceived because even our simple example of the chocolate chip cookie reveals that there are inherent subjective decisions that rubrics encompass, such as what counts as a good texture for me. That's a decision I made as the evaluator, right? It was even my decision what categories to list. You guys come up with different categories than me, but I don't have them in my rubric. So we often think of rubrics as being objective, but in fact, they are still subjective. The other bad of a rubric is that they certainly can be unwieldy, especially for low-level learners to comprehend because they are often text-heavy. Right? So reading and understanding the rubric itself can be a challenge for even advanced students and certainly for students with lower skills. So we'd like to focus now on how we can balance some of those goods and bads. We'll take a look at design features in terms of the good side of rubrics and then also take a look at the challenges. So for design features, because I'm a language specialist, I'm going to use examples that come from my field, the language field, and I'm going to think in terms, first of all, of a written essay. So when we break down a writing product, we tend to break it down into these categories. These are what I think are the ingredients of a good essay. You've got to have good content, good ideas. You have to organize those ideas well. As you move up in your proficiency, you're also expected to draw on outside sources to support your ideas. It's not just your opinion, but your use of sources to support your opinion. And then we have vocabulary and language use. And then we also have formatting and mechanics. Okay, so formatting and mechanics would be things like if it's typed correctly in the correct font and format. Basically, the joke I tell my students is whether your essay has on a swimming suit or whether your essay has on jeans or whether your essay is dressed in business clothes, right? You have to have the right attire for the essay that you're writing or for the product that you're writing. Now, many rubrics will take the use of sources and collapse that into the content. So I've given you these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas, but that doesn't mean that there are always 5 areas. It doesn't even mean that these are the only 5 areas, but this is for the example. The second example that I want to give you is how we have the categories for oral proficiency. So we tend to think of these types of events as being something like I'm doing right now, which is a formal presentation. But it could also be a poster presentation. We could think of these types of categories for job interview, interactive type of events, for example. If you're working in advertising, you could use something like this in terms of doing a pitch for a new product or a sales event. We tend to see here also content similar to the written rubric idea. Organization is one that also transfers across the two modes. Delivery of information is, however, unique to the speaking environment, right? Perhaps in a way you might think of it as the mechanics and formatting. Then there's visual aids, how the student works with or creates whatever that visual support might be, whether it's something like PowerPoint or a poster. And then also audience interaction, which in the rubrics that I have dealt with is often missing. The rubrics that I have seen for these types of events, they tend to focus only on those top areas, and they don't take into consideration that audience component. When we take a look at delivery, I talked on the previous slide about the possibility of collapsing categories, but it's also possible to blow up a category and break it down into more components. So delivery could be that vocabulary and language use that we saw with the writing. But it could also be presentation features, and we can even blow up presentation features more. That could be your style, whether the speaker's making eye contact. In terms of a language event especially, it might be phonological control, and then also fluency. So you could think of probably many different ways in which a student could do well in one area, but not in another area. So in terms of thinking about the rubric, we could start with 5 different categories, but if we really want to focus on delivery as something that's important to us for this particular event, then within delivery, you might have a student who does really well with the vocabulary and grammar, but they don't do very well with the presentation features. Or even within presentation features, maybe they do great with eye contact, but they aren't very fluent. So there's always a trade-off between collapsing, because when you collapse, it makes it easier for you to grade, it makes it easier for the student to parse and understand, but whenever you collapse it, you begin to blur lines between the different aspects that make up that larger component. So I'd like to give you a more concrete example of this tension by looking at a general and a task-specific example for a written product. In terms of what does it mean when we define the descriptor for the content and development. So this is one category, content and development, so taking that top area and blowing it up into the descriptions. This is the description just for the top grade. So if this is a top grade A for content and development, we would need a parallel description for what a B would be, a parallel description for what a C would be, and a parallel description for a D and an F as well. Okay? So taking a look at just the top score, you can see under general ideas, clearly address the assigned topic, incorporate source material very well. You can see how there might be a tension there, right? Maybe you clearly address the assigned topic, but you don't incorporate source material very well, right? But we have collapsed them into content and development, right? And the bottom one, skipping down to the bottom one that's in black, ideas are interesting, original, and sophisticated, and suggest excellent analytical skills and maturity of thought. So those are some general ways of talking about content and development. If we take the main ideas and supporting ideas, these are general descriptions that you can use. But if the type of essay that you're working with is a persuasive essay, for example, we might remove those main ideas and supporting ideas and instead give more specific details, like 3 points in favor of speaker's position are clear. Right? Use a wide variety of evidence. Possible counterpoints are raised and thoroughly refuted. So this is part of the tension. Right? Do you have general descriptions that basically fit for any writing product, or do you need to be more specific in what you expect students to do? Let's take a look. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted you now to take a look at your rubric, your handout. I think everyone here does have a handout, and those of you joining us virtually, you had access to it online. So looking now at the very first page of the handout, this is the content and development for writing. And you have all of the categories under the high category 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. And I'm also comparing here what a rubric might look like for a lower level student with what a rubric might look like for a higher level student. So a few things that I want to point out here. One way to make the rubric more simple for the lower level student is to have fewer categories, fewer descriptions. So in the low level, I have a 3, a 2, and a 1 rather than a 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. You can see that they're being expected to do a much more simple task, which allows us to be much more simple in our descriptions of what we want them to produce. And when you contrast that with the higher level example, I've done a little color coding here so that you can see across the 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0, you can sort of see how each of those bullets is intended to step down the expectation. So the black in the black font is all about whether the student is addressing the assigned topic. And if you're a writing instructor, this won't surprise you, but if you're not, it is surprising how often students don't actually address the topic that you've assigned them to address. The green is for how the student is working with the source information, and then the blue is dealing with the ideas themselves, the main ideas and the supporting ideas. So I've got a couple of discussion questions under there. I'm giving you an example for content and development, but thinking back to a former slide or using your own imagination, what other categories would you suggest make up a writing product other than content and development? You guys here are on the hook. This is the test. I'll give you a hint. Other than content, you might have, yes?
Like whether the essay is wearing a swimming suit or business attire?
Yes.
I love
whether
it.
the essay is wearing a swimsuit or business attire. So how it's formatted and the mechanics of the essay, right? You could have somebody who's got great ideas, but if the typing is really wackadoo, if they've got big spaces between the paragraphs that are in odd locations, these become distractions, right? And they are worth something in terms of how you are responding to the product that you're looking at, right? All right, and the second question I have for you is what advantages and challenges do you see in this example? So looking at the handout, is there something that jumps out to you as either something that you really like, that you maybe hadn't thought of before, or a challenge that you see that this example presents for you? Mm-hmm.
I think the descriptors are really helpful as far as giving feedback to the students is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I think where I personally have trouble with rubrics is, I can imagine myself, highlighting bullet point 1 in the excellent column,
Mm-hmm.
highlighting bullet point 2 in the weak column,
Mm-hmm.
bullet point 3 in the average column, and then at some point you have to decide, well, given that I've highlighted bullet points in all 4 or 5 columns, where do I end up? And then, you end up saying, okay, well, so on average, it gets a 2 average, but none of the descriptors completely describes the actual product.
Yes.
Which makes me want to break up rubrics
Yes.
into point-by-point. Yeah.
Thank you for that segue, that was not planned, into some tips for these challenges and this idea of collapsing versus and weighting and ignoring categories. Right? So a specific answer, though, to that challenge, I do encourage people to do what you just described. Circle the points across the different categories as needed, and then come up with the average. Now, in some cases, it will be easy if you happen to circle equal numbers of like 4s and 3s, then you can, it's a 3.5, right? So there's a little math involved with this workaround, right? But the other possibility is to pull it into different categories. But then you can see from the student's perspective, we take one category and now it has all of a sudden become 1 has become 5. And if I started with 5, now my 1 is 5 and 5, but now I've got 25 categories, right? So rubrics are presented to us as a way to help students break down a complex task into these the components that make up the task. But we are doing a disservice to the complexity of the task. We're doing a disservice to the complexity of the student output if we aren't aware that the rubric is still not going to eliminate some of the tensions that we see in a complex production. The best that I think that we can do is to come up with ways around it. And one way might be to do the average. Another way to deal with the challenge is to think about how you're weighting categories. So if you have 5 different categories, does that mean that they're all worth 20% of the total grade? Depending on where you are in a semester, or depending on how important a topic is to you as the instructor setting up the design of the test, you might decide to weight content times 2, or you might decide to weight grammar times 2. I mean, it depends on what you set up as the goals and objectives for the assessment moment. I think what's most important is that you're transparent with the student. So the student knows, hey, in this essay, what's most important, what's getting the highest amount of grade weight, where I need to put my biggest focus is on the content, not on the grammar. Or, okay, this time, she's really coming down on grammar. We've had all of these lessons. We're 75% of the way through with the semester. I'm expected to have a higher level of mastery of these accuracy points. And so now grammar is actually going to be 50-50 with the other elements of the rubric, right? And also the idea that it isn't necessary in terms of, from the student perspective or the instructor's perspective, that you grade all aspects of all papers at all times, right? So these are all questions that you as the instructor can grapple with, and you get to make those decisions, or your institution makes them for you and dictates them to you, in which case you have maybe less flexibility with dealing with this particular challenge. The second challenge is that we think of rubrics as being objective, but they are inherently subjective. And so I have here, this is not on the handout, but this is on the slides. These are common ways that you will find descriptors written. And I'd like to focus for the moment on the 0 column, like what gets a 0. Under comprehensibility, this is an example for like ways of doing oral speech. Often you get the 0 means that it's not comprehensible. That may be true and accurate and useful for a beginning level student, but as you move through your language studies, if you are advanced and you are still not comprehensible, like that should not just be so low on the rubric. Like that should come into play much earlier in the rubric design, right? So let's take a look at a more concrete example to try to demonstrate this. I've worked with an institution before where you have a multi-level program. So you have students moving upward through the ranks of the program. And we wanted to design one rubric that could be used in multiple classes, right? So what that ended up looking like was what was once the highest grade for whatever the category was, so whatever got the A, when you moved up into the next level, that same descriptor showed up as what was a B. And when you moved up into the next level, that then became a C. Right? So an advantage of this type of approach to creating vertical coherence is that students will see the same rubric across multiple classes. That diminishes the weight, the burden on the student to understand the rubric, because it's not constantly being populated with new descriptors, right? And at the same time, it is allowing you to recognize that what is considered acceptable for a beginning student is not considered acceptable for an intermediate student or an advanced student. Right? What's considered acceptable for the beginning of a semester in a math class is not going to be the same thing that's acceptable at the end of the semester. And so So it doesn't have to be across semesters. It can also be the notion of within a semester, right? The complexity is expected to increase, and so when we're designing our rubrics, we want to be able to reflect that. So the common default is that you get the 0 grade when it's not comprehensible, but yet that is really not necessarily an accurate description. It might be much more punitive much earlier in the rubric process if you're a more advanced student. An analogy could also be like the undergraduate student is expected to produce writing of certain levels. A graduate student is expected to present writing of different levels. That's the tension here. The next tip that I want to talk about is the idea, one other example. This one is on your handout. Take a look at the back of the first page. Here I have an example for you that's looking at oral presentation, and this one has organization and content development. So you have, in red, you have the words that would be used to describe the content and development, which could be a separate category, or here I have it collapsed as one category. The tip that I have for helping students work around complex expectations is that you can create a cheat sheet. So if you look in the first column, you'll see that organization and content development, underneath it, it has a breakdown of what I'm expecting for elements of an introduction, for parts of the presentation, and for elements of a conclusion. If I give students a cheat sheet, then when I start my descriptors, if you'll take a look just at that very top one, excellent introduction that effectively addresses all elements. I don't have to repeat in my rubric what those elements are, because I can have the student look back at my cheat sheet that identifies what those elements are. So as I move across from a 4 to a 3 to a 2, right, I might change my wording from excellent introduction, I might change it to appropriate introduction, or I might change it to sufficient introduction, or I might change it to somewhat efficient or somewhat effective, right? So the idea is that the cheat sheet allows you to shorten the language within the descriptor because you have a reference point for what that means outside of understanding the descriptors. The second example on the same page takes a look at this idea of interaction with the audience, and it breaks it down into even more components, because you can interact with the audience as the speaker. That's my job right now. But if you are teaching a speaking class or a communications class, it's also important what you're doing when you're in the audience. So I have here interaction with speaker as audience member. Okay. So in the second example, if you'll take a look, one thing I've done here to try to help a student parse the different categories is I've underlined some of the key words. So interaction with audience as speaker, excellently interacted with audience during Q&A without outward signs of nervousness. And that changes to though visibly somewhat nervous. Right? Here we also have to be careful because someone might be very nervous internally, but that's not what I'm able to see, right? I'm talking about what am I seeing from the outward side? What's the behavior they're displaying? So excellently interacted without outward signs becomes, though visibly somewhat nervous. Right? And as you move across the categories, you'll see other words underlined as a means of trying to help the student understand the differences between the high and the low score. And then you can see we can collapse the categories, organization and content development together. We can break them apart. Under Q&A, we could have Q&A as one category, but we could also have Q&A as two different categories. And here we want to go back to thinking about when in the semester is it happening? Is it necessary to record or grade this component at all times for all presentations or not? So one thing I've got two discussion questions here for us are to think about what interacted means. So I've used the word in the Q&A example, excellently interacted with. What does that mean? What does it mean to interact with? And so how could we create a cheat sheet that the student could understand better what I mean by interacted? So let me give you a minute to try to think of an idea. If you're here with someone, you have the ability to brainstorm with a partner, right? What do you think interacted means?
Checking for comprehension, asking questions that audience members respond to. Yes, right. But don't put your back to the audience. Make eye contact.
Exactly,
Yeah,
eye contact.
Like across the
Right. I was a little bit confused about the audience member if the grader, if the teacher would be considered as the one who is grading the students, or that would be
I think it
students.
means like, let's imagine that you have 10 presentations on a day. The other students, like the teacher would keep track of which students asked questions of the other students and just keep track.
Could those be students as well, asking questions?
Yeah, so students in the audience asking the student presenter.
And the teacher can...
And the teacher would record. Yeah,
So it's also like sending it back and forth.
the teacher can ask questions too.
Yeah. Usually, I used to do that before, I just wasn't sure. Since I have like novice beginners classes and those would be timid sometimes, they wouldn't want to participate also if you just like encourage them to know. I'm sure about this part.
Okay, so what's one idea that you came up with in terms of a cheat sheet for interacted? I heard someone say one.
Eye contact.
Eye contact. Right? Eye contact. Right? When you're the speaker and it's a Q&A, if someone asks you a question, yeah, you're expected to look them in the eyes and look everyone in the eyes, right? One thing I tell my, you may have asked the question, but when I give the answer, yes, I need to look at you first, but I need to remember that there's a whole audience out there that is needing to hear the information, right? So on the cheat sheet, it might be something like eye contact, right? Any other thoughts that you had? Yeah.
We had like eliciting questions. So you ask a question of the audience and then they give an answer back.
So ways of trying to draw information from the audience, trying to include information from the audience during the presentation. Now notice here, I put during Q&A. So in the example that you just gave, that's actually not during the Q&A, and so we have a problem with our rubric. That's a great characteristic. I either need to fix my rubric to allow that to be considered here, or it needs to be its own category, or it needs to show up somewhere else within the rubric, right? So part of the great thing of working with a rubric is unless you are stipulated to use a certain rubric, right? Unless you've gone through a piloting and you've decided that this rubric works for you, as you begin to use the rubric, you're going to discover ways that your rubric is not meeting your needs. And so you'll want to be able to be flexible and change the rubric, again, to the extent that that is what your working conditions allow you to do. This makes me want to go home and change my Q&A rubric as well. Right? As the audience member, what instructions do you think I need to give to the students before presentation day happens? Really the question here that I want to get at is we don't want to surprise our students. We don't want to wait until after the event has happened and be like, haha, you got an F for that, you didn't ask any questions. And the student's like, oh, I was supposed to ask questions? Oh, I was supposed to ask more than one question? Like, you do want to be transparent with your students about what your expectations are for them. And one reality that might help you in this particular circumstances is also to assign students to ask questions of their classmates if that fits within your working framework. Were there any questions that you wanted to ask about this particular example, or any thoughts or ideas you had for this example before we take a look at the next one?
So basically, we have to provide the rubric to our students beforehand.
Yes. Well, the whole, I interrupted you, right? The whole rubric, maybe not, right? depends on how you intend to grade them. Perhaps on the first presentation, you're not going to grade Q&A at all, whether speaker or audience, then don't put it on the rubric. Or maybe you can put it on the rubric, but put like an X through it, like, hey, guess what's coming in the next presentation, but we're not going to talk about that right now, right? So I have done both. I've given my students an entire rubric. I've given my students only part of a rubric, depending on what the focus is. But I think you want to introduce it to them ahead of time because you don't want them to be surprised about what the expectations are. I remember one time a person said to me, but then the student's just going to do what I tell them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, darn. All right, that's exactly what we want them to do. You know, we're not trying to set the students up to fail. We're trying to set the students up to understand what it takes to succeed. Now, they may not meet that expectation, but we don't want them to be surprised by what the expectation is. Yes, that's a very good question. And lower level students, and at the beginning of the semester, I think these are times where you don't necessarily bombard them with the entire rubric all at once. One time I got so crazy into it, I had a presentation rubric that was 3 pages. Okay, these were our most advanced students, but it was like wackadoodle. Yeah. So I have since decided that I either have to give them parts of the rubric or, break it down. And in fact, I even in some cases do part checklist, part rubric, depending on the categories. All right, the next rubric that I want us to take a look at is the third example. So for those of you at home, this is what the one that looks like. And this is actually a rubric that I did not create. It comes from the TESOL organization, where the TESOL organization is the mothership for my field. And this is what I'm doing for you guys today is something that many of us get together and do at this particular conference, where we present teaching tips and ideas and strategies for our fellow practitioners. And in order to make those presentations, we have to write a proposal. And that proposal then gets evaluated. And this is the rubric that my organization uses. This is part of the rubric that my organization uses to rate those proposals. And the higher rated proposals are accepted. All right. So I've circled here for us a few areas that I want you to look at. I've given you 2 categories, the category of purpose, participant outcomes, and session type. Session type means in this context, it could be that you're giving a presentation, that you're making a poster, that you're leading a discussion. So those are different choices that you have for your session type. The second category that I'm giving you to look at is the category called theory, practice, and or research basis. And I'd like for you to focus on what I have underlined and circled. That's the difference between getting a 3 rating, a 4 rating, or a 5 rating. And my question for you is, in what ways is this proposal subjective? It should say in what ways is this rubric subjective? In what ways is this rubric subjective? I'd like to know the difference between the proposal matches and the proposal is appropriate. Right? Number 5 says the proposal matches the session type. Number 4 says the proposal is appropriate for the session type. Now we have to get into a discussion of what is appropriate and what is matches and how are they different. We have, in 5, we have the objectives and participant outcomes are very clear and just are clear. Or stated or implied but may lack sufficient focus. I see that we have different adjectives, right? Different ways of talking about it, but what does that really mean when you are the person receiving that feedback, or what does it mean when you're the person giving the score, right? I have an understanding of those terms, and that's what makes this process still subjective. So rubrics are great, and they're a good strategy that is more advanced than what we have done, but they don't solve all the problems. And I realize I've talked my way into only having 10 minutes left. So let me give you my last tips. turning to the next one, the next page. Tips for challenges, right? Choose the most useful scoring mechanism. Don't feel that you must always use a rubric. A checklist might suffice, and that is your last example, right? Your last example tells you, or shows you rather, one way of looking at an interactive speaking event. It gives you the same basic skills that are needed for an interactive speaking event. It provides you an example of doing it as a checklist version and doing it as a rubric version. Most students are going to say, give me the checklist, please, rather than give me the longer rubric. Also, often I'm asked about how to deal with sort of, what about students turning things in on time? What about whether a student does teamwork appropriately if it's a team project? What if I wanted students to show me a first draft and a second draft, an outline of sources, and they gave me a great paper, but they didn't give me any of those intermediate steps that I asked for, right? Instead of putting those topics into your rubric itself, I treat them as deductions. For each of these categories, or for each of these requirements that you don't meet, it's a half point that you lose on the total grade. So, in sum, the general guidelines that I would leave you with is to remember that your designing a rubric is going to be a reiterative process. You're not going to get it right the first time, I don't believe. I have yet to get it right. I was making changes on this 2 days ago, going, oh, I think this is a better way to express what I'm trying to get at, right? You want to think about whether or not you want to collapse categories, which makes it easier to parse, but it also can conflate issues, so that you're having to score 2 things at once. Consider whether or not you want to weight a category. If grammar is really more important for this particular event, multiply times 2. Right? Use a cheat sheet as a way to help with clarity, which is basically a hybrid between a checklist and a rubric. Also, feel free to use deductions. And then don't try to grade every or all categories for every or all events throughout a semester. So thank you for joining us online, and thank you for being here. We have a few minutes for questions that I would be happy to try and answer. Yes, ma'am.
Do you create rubrics for every assignment you have for your students, or you have, let's say, 4 or 5 rubrics that you can use multiple times?
So the question was whether I have rubrics for all of the events, or whether I reuse certain rubrics or use rubrics only for certain events. Yeah, I only use rubrics for certain events. I think that there are some activities where a rubric is more trouble than it's worth, right? Especially if you think about having to socialize the student into the language of the rubric. So I also use checklists for different activities. Blog posting, for example, is something that it's a quicker activity that I want the student to do. I might use a checklist for a blog posting. There's no reason why you can't use a rubric, but I just personally don't for that type of event. Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever received feedback from your own students about the features that they like and dislike about rubrics, or the parts that they find easy to understand or useful? Or
I really haven't, and I don't know if that is... Oh, so the question was whether students have given me feedback on the rubrics. I don't know if students don't feel comfortable like expressing their concerns or their displeasures. Now, we do have the opportunity to talk about them in class, so I guess if I think of it from that perspective, students do give me feedback if they ask questions about the rubric, right? And in rethinking my answer to your question, then the most common question I'm asked in class is, well, what is an A versus a B idea? What makes my ideas just good ideas versus excellent ideas? So we often have a small conversation about creativity and insightfulness, and is it something new or a different way of looking at things? And also I try to use a lot of student examples to showcase what a different high-level way of thinking about a particular task might be. But that would be the biggest way in which I have gotten feedback from students. Yes, sir.
If you were to use your multi-level rubric within the same course, not over the program, but within the same course, would you give them all of the descriptors at the beginning, or would you kind of like roll out
Feed it
the
to them?
rubric changes this time, give them a new one?
I think if you can, it's best to do both. It's best to say, here's the big picture. For those of you who want to take a look at the big picture, here it is. But we're going to focus right now on this part of the picture. And I would spend my class time, helping students understand the specific part of the picture. Because different students are going to be able to take and use the information in different ways, right? So for the student who can juggle that much information at once, that student is probably going to be okay looking at it outside of class and maybe coming to you individually, right? But for the larger class purposes, I would focus on what is necessary right now. Yes, ma'am.
There's a question from our online viewer, Irina Zhirnuk from Ukraine. That's actually like a comment and a question, I guess, to you, if possible. What is the role of the student in creating a rubric? And it seems like, as for the presentation, they often decide on the rubrics together with the students by answering a question: what makes an effective presentation? And for example, during the module and presentations, formative assessment is focused on separate rubrics, whereas the summative one is based on all the rubrics identified. So can you give any recommendations on what adjectives and adverbs are to be used in rubrics describing performances?
Well, you can look at so there's a couple of things happening here. The comment is about student involvement in creating the rubric. I will often do sort of what I did with you guys, sort of, like here, like, what do you think makes an effective writing product? And don't show them my list, right? So they haven't actually led me to making significant changes, but often we find out that what they bring up matches what I have, right? So it's also a good way to introduce the concept of a rubric to them. The second part of the comment from overseas was a question about giving examples about language that you can use in the rubric. So there it went. This would be one set of adjectives, adverbs that I have seen frequently used within topic and content, moving from fully address or addressing a topic well, to mostly addressing a topic, to somewhat addressing a topic, to weakly addressing a topic, to they don't address the topic. Language use, there's no errors. I have a big problem with the use of no. I don't think that's, as we've been here together, I've seen 2 typos in my own slides. So minimal errors versus few errors versus some errors versus many errors versus severe errors. Okay. So this would be one set of language that I have seen suggested for use in rubric design. I think you could also take a look at the examples that I've given, and you could distill from that additional examples of ways to differentiate across the categories.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Are there maybe problems with using terms like this?
Absolutely. Which one do you think is the easiest? Absence of, yeah. Severe problems. Like it's pretty typically easy to do the 4 and the 0. Right? It's that middle ground that gets a little bit messier. Also, language use tends to be easier because grammar mistakes are something that are easier to count. Anything that you can count and put a number to is going to be easier to manage. That's why I try to use sometimes like that cheat sheet. So if I say there's 4 elements, and then I will work sometimes to think of 5 elements. That way I can say if you have all 5 elements, it's a 4. If you don't, it's a 3, it's a 2, it's a 1, it's a 0. Like, if you can find a way to make it more mathematical, you're going to make it easier to rationalize the score. But I find these terms to be problematic. I find that to be, in my opinion, this is the biggest challenge of using rubrics. They're presented to us as being objective. They're presented to us as taking subjectivity out of the grading process, but they do not. We still have that challenge that we have to be aware of. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that we have why, how, and the tool and then the score. So based on the score, we have to get a plan after that, later on to put the students on. So should this be included in the rubric that the students are aware of what's coming next, then if they achieve the score or that grade?
Well, I think rubrics in that regard are very flexible. So if there's something that's important to you, some aspect of the class arc of what's going to happen from the beginning to the middle to the end of the class, that a rubric allows you to put that into the design of the rubric. So, or you can treat it as a deduction to take away points. So I used to give students points for doing all of the steps that I wanted them to do, and then I realized that I had students that were getting higher grades than I wanted, that I felt that they really truly deserved, because they were just checking the boxes that I gave them to check. And so that's when I realized, well, instead of giving them points for doing it, let me reverse that logic and take away points for not doing it. So if you wanted to work score knowledge into the rubric, I think that you could do that. Make your rubrics work for you. Don't work for the rubric.
Sorry,
Yes,
one
ma'am.
more question. I'm
Yes.
sorry we're out of time, but how about peer evaluation by students? Use of rubrics used.
I think I would actually not use a rubric with peer-to-peer evaluation. I think a checklist version is more transparent for that purpose. And I also think with peer-to-peer evaluation, there's a big burden on the instructor to give very specific details about what you want that student to look for, what that student is capable of looking for. So an example of something that I think you could look for is, does the topic sentence include a main idea for that paragraph, sort of a yes-no kind of a thing. If your citations is another great one to do with peer review. Do you see the author's last name for all the citations? Things that deal with format issues. Those are better strategies. Checklist is a better strategy for peer-to-peer than rubrics, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending time with me this afternoon, or in the case of my friend in Ukraine, the evening. And
Thank you, they're so very helpful.
go forth and create some rubrics.
Thank you.
It feels weird to stand behind a podium.
Can you go?
Thank you. That's very sweet. Oh, a little happy. Well, thank you very much. You're welcome. So is there some sort of follow-up action that I'll need to do, or is this, or have I completed all of my homework assignments? Okay. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate your patience getting us through the process.
Thank you.
Lord, walk off and leave my cell phone here. That'd be bad.
Yeah. Good.
Some cookies are there?
I will take one before I go fight traffic.
Welcome.
Copy on something.
Well, I mentioned the one that I just had.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies, for spending time with us today. Thank you. Thank you.
That's what I saw here, is that you don't usually
But what I find fascinating is that it's a couple I go back to it that we treated as like this. Do you want to say the right word?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't.
But the thing is, like, a lot of these rubrics, like, I can see how, to the extent that it is possible to break things down, like when you're able to use descriptors that make sense, with adjectives that make sense, and that are kind of specific to the assignment, and very concrete, and very understandable and descriptive, it can really, really be helpful. I have trouble coming up with the descriptors at each level. I mean, a lot of the rubrics that I've been given as examples, basically all I see is, like, you've got the rubric, and you've got the categories, and then all the rubric does not only is say, exemplary use to this, adequate. And all it does is it has, like, exactly the same descriptors and everything, and the only difference is exemplary, sufficient, adequate, whatever. I'm like, if that's what you're doing, there's no need for all this text.
Exactly.
You might as well just say at the top, A is exemplary, B is whatever, and then just pick the letter grade, because you don't have to read it over.
Where it still is useful is it's caused people to think about what are the categories.
Right.
Like, what are the components?
Right.
But the descriptors themselves become messy.
Yeah.
Right? And
I
I think
haven't been able to find, like, the perfect
that's what,
balance.
when I my oral presentation one is the one that I for shits and grins, because I was doing an entire week-long workshop on rubrics.
This is specific.
I blew an oral presentation up into 3 pages. It was 3 pages to do like each.
Making a decision as the teacher or grading every single aspect, even if you remember.
Yeah. And so that's, in that one I use like a hybrid. Like for content and development, I think I still had the rubric, but for visual aids, it was just like points, like that merging it together.
We talk about rubrics all the time.
The bad, and not rubric. Well, I hope that this was what you had in mind.
Yeah, no,
it's
it's
a
great.
little different than what I did at TESOL.
It was a little,
but it was,
yeah.
I mean, not that you saved my ass at TESOL with the technology problems we were having, but yeah.
Was that on the top 10 rubrics?
Mhm,
It was that was this talk, about 75% of this talk. It was tweaked a bit for the things I learned and improved on something. This was actually a better talk than the one I gave you. Lower energy, because it's a smaller audience, but yeah.
You were both good.
No, thanks. Good. Well, I didn't have time to make that joke. Like, how would I rate on the whole presentation skill?
I was trying to give you thumbs up because
Oh,
when
yeah?
you were talking about making eye contact not only with the person who asked the question, but also kind of like, you're doing great, man.
Yeah.
Well, you become it is kind of funny. You do
and-
become sort of hyper aware
Yeah.
that you're engaging in the very activity for which you have
You're asking
designed.
They're
or
judging me
planned.
now, yeah.
Trying to get, listening from the audience, and we're like, get it.
Yeah. It's like, well, because I was like, okay, well, I only have 10 minutes left for Q&A, but I have involved the audience throughout the other things. It's true. All right, let's all get on the road before.
Yes.
it gets too boring.
Yeah,
Before
it
you-
shouldn't be too bad right now.
You know,
You going to Rockville though?
No. I live in Falls Church.
Oh, okay.
So
nice.
I'm going to take 29 turns into 50, according
Yes.
to my husband, and 50 goes within a mile of my house.
Well,
So I'll
good.
just get to 50 and ride it.
I'm gonna leave my stuff here for a second while I go.
You gonna walk me out?
Sure.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you again.
Hopefully we'll see you in a couple months.
Yes, why I was thinking you in a couple months.
The advisory board.
Oh yes,
So
and
you're
also
gonna
I
try to
plan.
keep
I'm
that.
going to try to come physically for the advisory board for the first time, and also I'm hoping to come to your conference.
Yeah.
At least one of the 2 days.
Yeah, good.
So yeah, I'm not doing anything this time, but come and learn.
Well, good.
Come and
Yeah,
learn.
we should have to schedule it pretty soon. People are supposed to confirm their attendance for the
What
time.
is it? I'm not doing it, guys. You guys are intense. Some good stuff in there. Much better than my
Is
cookies.
it Kool-Aid?
Huh?
Is it Kool-Aid?
No, it's
Oh,
like
yeah?
tea and chocolate.
That's an old.
I get it.
All right. I'm going to be really rude and high maintenance. What do I do with this?
We'll
I
take care
can?
of it.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's like, at this point now,
Okay, all right, let me get out of here. Get on the road.
Bye.
Good to see you.
See you again.
See you soon. Thanks for the invitation.
No problem. I'm glad you could come. Thank you.
I'm walking this way because this is how we came in. So
Did you use a flash drive or anything?
I did not. I had emailed it to myself, so we're good. I also emailed it to you, but just so I would have it back. I know.
try to squeeze them all on one page, but I think this one's too small. Okay. Really dark. I think it's too dark. It's supposed to be like a bluish color. The whole thing should be a bluish color. Do you have any old ones? Just look at it. You see the difference. This is okay. And you should just tell me whatever you are this year. I keep this one. Yeah. It's like a bluish on there. They may have tried to do it darker because they may have thought it was bad. But that's kind of, it's not supposed to be a bumblebee. So you bring the mugs to me today or tomorrow? How many are there? Well, I'll see how long in here. Make sure you get one of these fluorescent.
Hi guys. I'm
Did
gonna.
you learn anything you can use?
Huh? Oh yeah, for sure. I took all kinds of notes.
I like that multi-level thing she was talking about.
Yes, I've been thinking about that so much. I didn't mention that to her, but I keep thinking how over the course of a semester I want to hold my students to
Why are you so
higher
out of breath? You're
standards.
not morbidly obese.
What's that?
Why are you so out of breath? You're not morbidly obese.
I literally ran up the stairs. Yeah, I wanna, so like,